Moody Radio Cleveland, Brian and Jannelle Mornings. On live now with David Williams. He's speaker, evangelist, also chapter coordinator for the local Save One team, and it serves men and women who have survived and are struggling from abortion of a child. Welcome, David.
Hey, Jannelle, how you doing?
Good.
Good to be on with you.
I love that you're on this week. I was just telling Ron how even with Mother's Day, we get so consumed with it. We don't take time to recognize that there are many, even in the Christian family, who are in pain. And that, of course, happens with dads as well. Yep.
Yeah, you're right. So, Father's Day, evokes a lot of emotions, maybe different than Mother's Day, because we're dealing with a lot of things. People, whether it's their relationship with their dad, some people not knowing their dad. Yeah. But oftentimes we don't think about even the men, and there are men that are hurting. Some are hurting because of their relationship with kids or lack of relationships with kids. And then you got a group of men who are hurting because they lost fatherhood due to the tragedy of either a miscarriage or even a worse tragedy of abortion. And there's a great wound that men have. So you're right. I think there's a lot of men, and we often don't think about those men who, in the eyes of God, even if they haven't met their children, they were fathers. They are fathers of children that they lost the privilege of being able to have a relationship and know.
And it's specifically those who have experienced loss through abortion. Can you just speak a little bit on how the pain is manifested and a little bit on how connected men are to the pain that they feel to that event that they experience with the loss of abortion? Are they aware of it? Do they connect it clearly and understand it?
I think it's hard for men, because if you think about our cultural narrative when it comes to even pregnancy, we have a cultural narrative that say, it's a woman's right to choose. It's a woman's health issue. And so the man is rarely thought about. So even in that process where we know that there's a man and a woman that came together for the conception of a child, the man is almost looked at as an uninvolved third party. So he's really minimized. And so even from the womb, we minimize fatherhood. So when an abortion does happen, nobody tends to think about the man. Nobody tends to think about the fact that there is pain and grief that comes. And so I think for men, we become disconnected from it. It was a woman that was pregnant. She was carrying a baby. And I don't think a lot of men, recognize the pain that it brings. But there is a hurt. There's a loss. There's something that breaks in a man. And I think it's manifested in a number of different ways. For some men, it's anger. For others, it's depression. For some, it's turning to substances, whether it be drugs or alcohol. Some, it's nightmares. For some, it's an inability to really connect with children that they have in the future. For some, it affects their relationship with women, maybe a distrust, or just seeing women as a way to kind of heal their hurts or minimize their pain. So it's manifested in a number of different ways, and I don't think a lot of times it's easy for men to connect because of the disconnection we've allowed there to be in society, where we don't recognize men in the role that they have as fathers. And so later on, we don't recognize that there may be a great pain that comes to men as they've lost a child due to an abortion.
This is a very personal thing, so many can be around or connected in relationships with men who have experienced this loss and not know, even if you see them struggling with depression and all that. So what are things we can do in our families and in our churches to minister to these men who may not even know and never share the story of the loss they've experienced?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Jannelle. I think one, within the church, within pregnancy center ministries, it's even validating the man in his role as a father, and as in that role as from the very beginning, from the womb, and then recognizing, as we live in a culture where there has been so many million abortions, 61 million abortions, so that's babies that have died tragically. There are women that have been hurt, and many of them are in our church. but also just remembering that with every one of them, that there's a man. And so there are men that are walking around wounded, and many men who I have the privilege of being able to speak into their lives. It's been something that they've carried around for years. I mean, I meet men who are 65 who this happened to them when they were 20, 25, and for 40, 45 years, they've been carrying around this wound, and it's affected them in many different ways. It's affected even their relationship with their wives. Some of them are married, and, they have kids now. So just looking at, we would never know, but it's impacted their relationship with their wives. It's impacted their relationships with their kids. Some of them are in church, and they're even serving, but the motivation for serving becomes kind of distorted because in some sense it could either be, I'm serving to try to atone for this horrible thing that I've done. Mm-hmm. Or you got some men who go to church and they don't feel like I'm worthy to be able to serve because of what happened in my life. And so it's helping them to understand the grace of God, that God has, even in spite of that through Jesus there is healing, there is grace, there is forgiveness, there's restoration and redemption. And I think we just need to be cognizant to be willing to minister to those things. And one of the things that God is, this is a part of my story, as God has brought, made that known to me in a number of different ways. And as he's ministered healing to me, one of the things he's given me is a ministry to minister that grace to other men. So as a part of it, part of the way that I bring that to light is by sharing my story. So I'll share it in churches. Yeah. I'll share it at pregnancy center banquets. I share it on videos that I have, just making known to men that you're not alone, that there is a great pain that happens and it affects us in deep ways. But there is a great healing and restoration that God has for us if we're willing to open up those wounds and invite Christ into a very hard place that often we don't want to revisit because it is a difficult thing. For many, many men, it was something that, they wanted. It was like they didn't want the baby, and so they may have told their partner to do it. For other men, it's hard because they did want the child, and they felt like they had no say, they had no voice. And regardless of whether someone kind of pushed for it, supported it, or had no voice, the wound, the pain, the hurt is real, it's deep, and Christ wants to minister to these men.
David, you say you share your personal testimony of loss of fatherhood due to abortion. How did your story of healing begin?
The abortion was when I was 19, so 30 years ago. And from that, there were a lot of things that began to happen in my life. Alcohol was a part of it before, but it was kind of have fun. And afterwards, it was kind of drowning my sorrows. I became very promiscuous. I was almost like bipolar. These extreme highs, these extreme lows. Felt like such a failure. I had to, there was really a push to be successful in my education because it's like I'm going to atone for this wrong that I did. And there was just great anger that was manifested out of me. And that was really overtaking my life for a number of years. I came to know Jesus when I was 26, and I knew I was totally forgiven of everything that I had done, including the abortion. And there were some things that God began to radically do in my life, setting me free from sexual immorality and drunkenness. But then there were some other things that seemed to hang on. Got married to a godly woman, and there was still just great anger that would come out of me. And sadly, in our early marriage, there were things that I said and did that hurt my wife tremendously. We started having kids. We have 6 children, and it was just hard to bond with my kids. And I was wondering, what's going on with my heart? And I'm in ministry, and there was this drive to be successful in ministry, and it was more about David than about the glory of God. And I was very paralyzed when it would come to make big decisions with my wife and I. I'd just be paralyzed and was wondering why these things were happening. Well, it happened about maybe 8 years ago. I was asked to speak at a pregnancy center banquet because I wasn't afraid to share that was a part of my story. So I was asked to share about the forgiveness that God had given me for being involved in an abortion. So I shared that night, and there happened to be a man that was there who happened to do anecdotal research on the effects of abortion in men. So he comes to me afterwards, and he gives me his card. We have this conversation. He asked me this crazy question, which I thought at the time, he asked me, how have you allowed Jesus to heal you from the wound of abortion? At this time, it had been 20-something years, like 21 years since the abortion. I'm like, man, in my mind, I'm thinking, Jesus has healed me from the abortion. Man, why'd you ask me a crazy question? But I didn't say that to him. What I said to him is I never have invited Jesus to heal that wound. So he goes, can I send you a book? He sends me a book called Fatherhood Aborted. And all of these things, Jannelle, I had been dealing with in my marriage and with raising my kids. As I read this book, it was like the Holy Spirit pulled the curtain back and began to show me the connection of how that abortion affected me and was still affecting me today in some very significant areas. I went through an abortion recovery Bible study at Cleveland Pregnancy Center, and God began to bring freedom and healing and forgiveness to areas of my life that I didn't even know, that began to impact me and as a husband, as a father, as a minister of the gospel. But it almost took a man to come to me to make that connection. But as he did, and as I opened up those wounds for Christ to bring healing to them, the Lord began to really minister to me. Like, David, as I've ministered my healing and grace to you, there are lots of men out there with a similar story as yours. They're walking around under a cloud of shame and guilt and condemnation. They don't even know why. It's causing them to do all these different things in their marriage or outside of their marriage with alcohol and substances, and they can't even make the connection. And God just began to stir my heart, like, David, I want to use you to share your story so that other men who have this in their story can begin to see the connection. And as they do, they'll begin to invite me, just as you did, into those wounds so that I can bring healing and grace and restoration to marriages, restoration to their relationships with their children, and help these men really rise up to be who I've called and created and redeemed them to be, in spite of even this horrible thing that exists in their past. And so with that, I now am a volunteer staff with a group called Save One. And as you mentioned, Jannelle, we do help men, women, and families to recover from abortion. I have the privilege of ministering to men with Bible studies. We have a 10-week Bible study. It's called Save One, the Men's Study. And in it, we'll help men to really even get a right picture of God, because that's where it all starts, with your view of God, for them to really go back and look at what happened to them so that they can truly invite Christ into that and to bring healing, to look at some of the symptoms that may have propped up from being involved in it, such as guilt or anger or sorrow, shame or depression. We help them to look at forgiving others, looking at God's grace, how God's grace is even greater than their sin and can bring restoration to them. For a lot of men, one of the hardest things in it, especially if they were the ones pushing for it, is they have a hard time forgiving themselves. So helping them to understand God's forgiveness to them so that they can truly, the God who is holy and who knows everything about us has paid the debt in full, that we no longer have to beat ourselves up because Christ paid it fully, helping men to understand that, helping them to renew their mind, to think about themselves the way that God says that they are, and not, what the world says or what they've done, what that may say, but who is God calling you to be, helping them to even reclaim the life of their child, to give dignity and worth and value to this life, that though they, we never met our children, these children were created in the image of God and have great value. And so we work through that. And then just calling these men up at the end of it to be a man of courage. Now that God has impacted your life in this area, he's calling you to minister to multitudes of other men out there that are hurting and struggling, and they don't know where to go and they don't know where to turn. And now you have the opportunity to take Jesus to them in an area where they are deeply wounded. So that's been a little bit of my struggle, and how God is using it now to even minister to other men, which is ministering to families, which is ministering to churches, and which is ministering, to people in our community and in our world.
David's story started with Save One, and there are local workshops right now through Cleveland Pregnancy Center that you can take advantage of. If you want information, text me right now, and I'll connect you with the phone number that you need. David, I also wanted, before we wrap up, you mentioned you married your godly wife, who's actually a dear friend of mine. How, for women who are listening, who know their husband's struggling after a loss of fatherhood due to abortion in the past, whether or not it was in their marriage or in their relationship. What are ways that women can minister to their husbands?
That's a great question. I know, my wife from the very beginning. It's interesting because with some of the guys that I'm working with,
yes,
oftentimes, unless their wife was involved, and I do have a number of that it was their wife that was, the party that was involved, and so both of them are hurting. So there is a knowledge they know. But for some men, that it's such a deep secret that there are men that I have worked with who are in their 50s, and this happened when they were a teenager, and they've been married for 20 years, and their wife doesn't know.
Wow.
And so sometimes it's hard, and I think for the wife that does know, it's kind of delicately like offering grace and pointing them, reminding them that what has happened to you is not who you are. And now that they, maybe for women are realizing that there is a place of healing, just encouraging without necessarily pushing, but just encouraging. I would say one thing, the book that I read, I think would be a great one. It's called Fatherhood Aborted. And if it's something that the wife does know, it could be maybe a gift she gives to her husband and just ask him to read it. And for me, it just began to just pull back the curtain. And I began to see like this thing was deeply affecting my life in ways that I didn't even recognize. And I think as a man begins to realize that, and that there are avenues where I can go, not only have I been wounded, but now there's some avenues where I can go to get help, that it helps when you can begin to connect the dots. So a book as simple as Fatherhood Aborted. It's actually one that is a downloadable book.
Okay.
I have it on my website. If somebody goes to davidwilliamsspeaks.com, I have a tab that's called Abortion. One of the tabs under that is Men in Abortion. But if you go on that Men in Abortion page, there is a downloadable book of that. And so maybe even email something like that, if it's a knowledge that the wife has, like I know this is something that's a part of your past, this may be a resource to help, and just throw it out there and let the Holy Spirit, deal with her husband's heart. And then pray for him, pray that God will bring that healing and grace to him. Those would be some things that I say.
Great stuff. David Williams, speaker and evangelist. Can you just give us a little bit more information if people want to learn more about Save One?
Yep. So there's Save One chapters around the country. As you mentioned, there is one in Cleveland at Cleveland Pregnancy Center, which is run by my good friend Bob Hershey. So if you're in the Cleveland area, you can contact Cleveland Pregnancy Center, or you can go to Save One's website, which is saveone.org. And they have chapters listed even around the country. I know the listening area is greater than Cleveland, goes into, Pennsylvania. So if someone's listening, feel free to go to that website, and there'll be information there.
David Williams, thank you for being on with us with such an important topic.
Hey, you're welcome. Thank you, Jannelle.
Yeah.
God bless you. And tell Lynn I said hello.
I will. I will.